Hello, I'm Josie Gwynn, co-founder and CEO of the Resilience Resource. The Resilience Resource is a nonprofit providing mental health, crisis and trauma care and training to individuals, communities, and organizations experiencing crisis and disaster. The Resilience Resource team has spent time in international disaster contexts ranging from hurricanes and earthquakes to global pandemics to war zones. I want to introduce you to Stacy Conard. Stacy is one of our valued team members here at the Resilience Resource and has extensive experience providing trauma care and training to individuals and communities around the world. If you want to learn more about Stacy and her background, you can check out her bio on our website at www.theresilienceresource.org. Welcome to this workshop module.
Hi, thanks for joining us. In this video, we'll be talking about helping children and teens in crisis. Like adults, children experience trauma as a deep wound of the heart and the mind, and it affects every part of them. It affects how they process information. It affects how they relate to other people. It affects what they think about. It affects how they feel in their body. And it affects their emotions. This happens when someone experiences an overwhelming event and it's a terrible event that overwhelms their ability to cope. It also usually involves intense fear, feelings of helplessness. And one thing I want us to remember is something about perception. So traumatic events, really how traumatizing it is to a person is all about the perception of the event to the person. If the child's perception is that something is life-threatening and that they are powerless to stop it, then that could be very traumatic for them. And it may be a very different perception from what a parent or a caregiver has about the same event. So let me give you an example. So for a small child, if they're watching and the neighborhood dog comes running across the field, and this child doesn't know the dog, and the dog looks angry and the teeth are showing, and that maybe the dog's barking or growling, and they come running, the child's afraid, and the child starts screaming or crying. And maybe there's some adults there and they know that this neighborhood dog named Bubbles is harmless. They might even be laughing because they don't see anything wrong. They don't see any danger or threat. But the child has registered a threat to life. And they feel like their life is in danger, and they feel completely helpless to stop it because Bubbles is twice their size. So Bubbles comes running up and stops, and nothing happens. Well, even though nothing happened physically to the child, what they internalized was intense fear and helplessness. And so it may be that years later, that same child grows up, and every time they encounter a dog, they have a racing heart. They have all these internal feelings, very uncomfortable feelings, and they don't understand. But it all goes back to that perception of that early event. And the other people there with the child have no long-lasting effects from dogs. They're not afraid of dogs. They have no problem with dogs because they knew their perception of what was happening or about to happen was completely different. So perception's always important, not just with children. That's important for adults too. But keep in mind, children's perception of events, their perception of how powerful they are or not powerful to stop something or inhibit it is very different from adults. Now, children who are separated from their caregivers when a traumatic event occurs or shortly after are really more at risk for traumatization. So that's important to remember, but it's also good because we know from studies that children who experience trauma and they have a significant caregiver like a mom or dad beside of them during the event, those children have a much higher rate of recovering more quickly from the trauma than children who experience something alone. Is that it can be very confusing for children when the things that they normally do to feel better aren't working. So because kids don't have the vocabulary, or sometimes they don't have not just the vocabulary but the understanding of the nuances of emotions, there are so many mixed emotions that they might feel when they're experiencing crisis and going through that. And so that is difficult for them to process, not only because they don't always have the vocabulary, are not always able to understand how the emotions might impact them. Normal things they do maybe aren't working, whether that's, going to play with friends or ride a bike. They don't want to do that anymore. It's not helping them. They still feel terrible. Whatever it is, those things aren't working. It's just like that with adults. When our normal coping mechanisms or strategies or things we do that help us feel better aren't helping us feel better, that can be very scary. Children have experienced a traumatic event. They need safe places where they can express their emotions, safe places where they can just play and move, but they can be protected and watched over. And it is important because sometimes parents who are also going through a crisis with their kids, they might emotionally shut down or pull away because of the intensity of all the experiences. And so when parents are maybe too traumatized themselves to watch over or care for their child, or when they shut down emotionally or even physically, that can be very scary because those parents aren't able or unwilling maybe to interact with kids, and that leaves children feeling very vulnerable, and even more so, they're just not able to process alone all the things that they're experiencing. Now, sometimes this isn't because parents are necessarily traumatized themselves, but sometimes it's just the stress, and maybe an easier reaction, like in the moment, is to tell children, go play, or you go, leave us alone right now because we're busy working on this plan, or we're busy packing or doing these things. And it might seem like the kid is fine and they can go off and play or do their thing, but actually they are feeling very scared and vulnerable because unless the parents communicated really well with them and spent time with them, they don't have all the information that the parent does. So they don't know what's going on. Children often too will mirror the emotions of their parents. So if you're showing fear, that especially those young children, they might reflect that also. At the same time, if a parent is calm, steady, and they're not showing extreme fear, and they're conveying to the child that they are okay, then the child is more likely to be okay, or the child is more likely to take that cue from the parent. Now let's talk about helping and how kids are uniquely affected and all the ways they're affected. This is a discussion question, so you can stop and engage with this one. How have you seen children change after experiencing a traumatic event? So that's part one of your question. How have you seen children change after experiencing a traumatic event? And I want you to take that and think about those children that you've seen or that you know, the traumatic event that they experienced, and then what were some of the significant changes in behavior, in the emotions that they were expressing, maybe some of the physical things that they were experiencing in their body, and maybe just take time right now to make a list of all those things that you've noticed in children that you know or you've heard about in children. Okay, if you've paused the video and you had time to engage with that question, how are children uniquely affected by trauma? Now, some of these things are not just unique to children. Let me say children and teenagers, and you might see some reflection in also how adults are impacted. But let's talk about kids, the children you know, and how have you seen their behavior impacted after a traumatic event, or their emotional expression, or maybe the physical things going on in their body. What are the changes you've seen? So let me just throw out a few of these, and you might have these on your list. If you do, tick them off. And you might even have some others that you could add if we were all in a group together. So one thing that people often will write down on their papers for this question is children who've experienced a critical event or a traumatic event, might be very clingy, almost overly attached. They're afraid for their caregiver to go away. So all of these things that we're going to talk about are really actually normal. So that can be very reassuring, especially to older kids and teenagers. But it can be helpful for parents to understand these are normal. Another thing might be poor school performance. It might be difficult for them to focus. They might be disorganized. They might lack attention, and that might have been somewhat of an issue before, an attention deficit, but maybe that's really exacerbated after a traumatic event. Or it might be a completely new thing that you haven't seen before. Another one is kids who begin to take on responsibilities as if they were an adult. And sometimes this is necessary in crisis for families, especially if one adult or one caregiver is not in the picture and the child has to step up and do things that normally they wouldn't. The problem here is when the child continues in that role and they can't seem to let themselves just be a kid anymore. How about fighting and aggressive behavior with others? Do you have that on your list? You probably do. Sometimes, just like adults, kids can experience that hypervigilance, being hyper alert, very edgy, anxious. You might notice some like agitation, being fidgety, all those things. Sometimes there's a lot of anger, and that's an emotion. So a lot of that can come out maybe towards other people and in their relationships. Children might engage in more rebellious, not as compliant as they were before. Maybe risky behaviors or even self-harm. And now what about in their bodies? Let's talk about some physical things that might be going on, and they might manifest as certain behaviors, but one of those would be regressive type behavior. So wetting the bed. So they're wetting the bed, maybe they're sucking their thumb. Children do all kinds of regressive things when they're stressed. So they might have been developmentally right on track, and then suddenly it seems like they've reverted back to an earlier developmental stage, and that's completely normal in times of very, very high stress. So how parents handle that can be super important to the child's recovery. So children might experience nightmares. That also might be, flashbacks to the event that just happened in the middle of the day where they'll be thinking, or they might perseverate about a particularly stressful part of the event, where they think about it all the time, and it becomes a problem because they can't concentrate on other things because they're constantly perseverating or thinking over and over about this piece or something that happened. So sleep disruptions, not being able to sleep well, or sleeping too much. How about a loss of appetite? Either losing their appetite, losing weight, or overeating, because food can be comforting to some people. So having aches and pains in your stomach or in your body, somewhere, headaches, stomach aches. Some kids even will break out in hives for no reason. It's the stress. So there is a reason, but it may appear like there's nothing physical going on or nothing that you can explain. And these kind of things it may even be that the child goes for a full medical review, which is always a good idea when someone's having any kind of symptoms that manifest physically, or to take them for a good medical checkup. And if nothing shows up, it doesn't mean there's not an injury. It doesn't mean there's not a wound. Keep in mind, we talk about trauma as a wound. It's just an internal wound that you can't see, but it still needs attention and it still needs care. So you might also see with older kids, they're not paying attention to their personal hygiene. They're not taking care, they're not bathing, brushing their teeth, doing the things that they previously were doing. And also some emotions. So fear, you probably have all these on your list. Fear, anger, even rage from kids. Lots of anxiety, maybe being very sad or depressed and withdrawn from others. Maybe they used to be a child who was very playful or friendly or outgoing, and now suddenly they're withdrawn and they want to keep to themselves and they don't want to do the things they used to do. That confusion for kids, apathy, I don't care what happens anymore, feeling that responsibility that they have to be the adult, they have to do adult things. And then finally, survivor's guilt. So this happens a lot for older children who come out of situations where maybe they survived something and others didn't, or they were uninjured and others were. It really is something that needs a lot of attention and care, but can make people want to withdraw into themselves and pull away. So survivor's guilt may be something that kids feel a little bit, and it can be something that you talk to them about, and they move on and they understand that it's it's a piece of what happened and you acknowledge it. But it can also be a very, very painful and deep wound that they carry with them. So you're going to want to pay attention to any kind of expressions of shame or guilt or self-blame for what happened. 3 questions I would suggest as an observer and as you observe and assess children, right? So in any kind of crisis intervention type work, observing and assessing what you see are 2 key pieces. And there are 3 questions that you can ask. And you can ask, you need to ask people that know the children. So the first one is this a new behavior or experience for this child? So if they're experiencing some physical things or they're behaving in a certain way, has this been going on for a long time, like before the traumatic event, or did this start after the traumatic event? That gives you a good piece of information. But if you're not familiar with the child, you wouldn't just know that. So you're going to have to ask people who have some history with that child. So that might be the parents or caregivers. And then to be able to ask what happened that precipitated this behavior starting. Okay, what was it? And how, the third question really to ask yourself is, how might the child have perceived that event? What was it and how did the child perceive that event? And that could just help you know, are these behaviors, or could they possibly be linked to a traumatic event that the child has experienced and they're trying to process it. And then you would have more to go on as you assist the child and help them, and you help the parents and the caregivers for the child. So how do people, this is another question that you're going to want to engage with, how do people usually respond to kids that behave in the ways we just talked about? So kids who are very aggressive, who lack attention, they're not focused, they're running around, or kids that are very withdrawn, regressive behaviors. How do adults typically respond to those things? Take just a minute, engage with that question, and then we'll carry on. 3 ways that we've identified that are typical for parents and caregivers and others when they encounter some of these difficult behaviors in children. 1, isolation. So that's very common, especially in times where parents are in high stress themselves. They might send the child off to be alone, go to your room, or go play, or in some other way they isolate the child from themselves because the behavior is, maybe the behavior is annoying, maybe that behavior is just difficult and the parent doesn't have the emotional energy or capacity to feel like they can handle that behavior from the child, and so they isolate the child. It could be that it's just easier if the child is withdrawn, is already isolating themselves, then and the parent doesn't have the emotional energy or strength to engage with the child, or maybe it's not observant of the child, then the child can be left in isolation. Another way is discipline or punishing. So punishing children for their bad behavior. And these all can happen. Let me just say, even when people know that a critical incident or a traumatic event has happened, and now maybe they're not making the connection between the traumatic event and this new behavior. And if they're not making that connection, then they can just assume that it's just bad behavior, okay, and that it can be corrected with some kind of discipline. And so often that's what happens is parents rely on some kind of, taking away privileges or some kind of physical discipline or whatever it is. The last thing that we see is shaming, and that especially happens with these regressive behaviors. That can also be more of a cultural thing. But with the regressive behaviors, when kids start doing things that kind of puts them back, then sometimes parents might shame them by saying you're being a baby, big kids don't suck their thumb anymore, or that, you shouldn't be wetting the bed, and kind of those shaming, guilting maneuvers to try to talk the child out of it or convince them that they shouldn't do it. But it's not going to be really effective with a child who is unconsciously, they're acting out their trauma. So the next question is, how do we help these kids? How do we help them? We don't want to do further harm to them. We want to understand where they are. Well, Dr. Diane Lamberg has a great quote, and I think it's foundational for helping kids. She says, and adults, let me say that, but she says, be patient and be patient some more. Be patient and be patient some more. We need to be gentle and we need to be patient with children. We can't treat them like they're adults. And of course, even with adults, we want to be gentle and patient, but we can't treat children as if they have the same ability to process, the same ability to understand as maybe an adult would have. So be patient and be patient some more. Children may need help calming down. How do we help them? How do we help de-escalate when a child's behavior or their emotions are out of control? Or maybe they're escalating their behaviors. How do we address that? Well, first of all, we keep our voice calm. So the temptation is always to raise your voice and be louder than the children, but rather than being louder than them, be lower than them in the tone of your voice. And also, slow down your talking. Don't talk quickly. Get on eye level with the child. You're looking them in the face, in the eye, not looking down at them from a power position, but you're looking at them, okay? You're looking at them, you're lowering your voice, and you're slowing down your words, okay? So they have to slow down to hear you and to respond to you, okay? And even if initially the child keeps going up and up, just carry on very patiently, slowly. And I would also say, if you're giving directives to the child, don't give a lot of directions. Don't put a lot of information in what you're saying. Don't overload them with a lecture. Just be concise, be brief. Tell them simply what you need or what you'd like to see. Or if you have a question, phrase it very simply for them, okay? Listen to the pain of children. So you have to create those opportunities and kind of that platform for them to speak. A really good question for children that are old enough to understand it is there something you have seen or heard today that you want to talk about? Is there something you've seen or heard today that you want to talk about? Think about that question, especially for families who are moving, especially for situations where maybe every day something's changing. New people, new places, new things to do they haven't done before, maybe new ways of surviving. Children may have been exposed to really terrible things that adults don't even know that they saw or heard. Or it could be they've overheard some scary information and they don't fully understand it. And they need an opportunity. That's an invitation. Is there anything you've seen or heard today that you'd like to talk about? That could be something that could be a daily check-in question. I think what's really important around it is the parent or the caregiver, their body language, where they are. Are you sitting down? Are you really inviting a dialogue about that question? Are you really inviting the child to talk? Or is it just an opportunity for you to tell them everything you know about the situation? Let them talk. Listen to them. Listen to their concerns as well. And a word of caution for parents. I have 5 children. They're teenagers and young adults now. And one of the temptations I have as a parent, a mom, is when hard things happen, I want to put a spin. I want to reframe it for my children. I don't want them to hurt. And so parents, we do that a lot of times with our kids. Maybe our motives are good, but the end result is not always good. Children and teens can feel like you didn't hear them and you didn't really acknowledge the hard thing that they're feeling. So just be careful about that. It's okay to say, I understand. I feel sad too sometimes. With very little children, they need you to give them words for their emotions. So you might say, I noticed that you look sad, and you can make a sad face. And you can say, I feel sad too, if that's true. It's okay to say that. It's okay to let children see it on your face when you say the word. You can even play a game with younger children where you ask them, show me angry, and you let them act out angry with their whole body, like, you could even do it for them if they seem uncertain about how to do this. And then you try out different emotions, show me sad, show me frustrated, whatever you think of. But that's a great little game to play with young children to help give them words, vocabulary for emotions, and help them kind of match those emotions up to appropriate expression. Also use your phone. Emojis on the phone are terrific. Kids of all ages love them, but especially kids that don't have words. You can ask the child, pick out an emoji that shows me how you feel right now. You can have a check-in with your teenager, and every day it can be a fun game of, like, through the day, sending emojis, but you have to send them too. So you have to show your teenagers how you're feeling and being a little bit transparent. So emojis are great on the phone. Another thing you're going to want to do is establish routines as soon as possible. That, of course, that can be difficult in a critical incident, especially if people are moving. Maybe you're not in your home anymore, you're not with familiar people or in surroundings that you're familiar with. But children really need the security of routine. And so parents, caregivers, as soon as possible, if you can start working in familiar things. If it's a bedtime that's the same every night, or we do this certain routine for bed, we brush our teeth, we say our prayers, whatever it is. Children also, it can help them to have a familiar item, of comfort item that they keep with them. And also just doing fun things. So playing a game together every day that can be part of your routine that your child starts looking forward to because they know it's coming. Or it can be like a special meal that you do every week at a certain time, or whatever it is. There's a lot of ways to create routine for kids, and that's a sense of security for them. Another thing you want to do is tell the truth. Tell the truth in an age-appropriate manner. In many cultures, in many places, we don't necessarily tell the truth to children when something bad happens. And unfortunately, what children imagine can be much worse than the actual event even. And that children can also fill in a lot of the blanks, a lot of the things they don't understand. They will fill in with their own understanding of it, which means sometimes they can even be blaming themselves for something that they have no responsibility in at all. But we don't know that if we're not, one, listening to them, talking to them, asking them questions, but two, if we don't tell them the truth, then it's more likely that they're going to come up with a lot of their own answers, or they'll get answers from their friends if they're teenagers. So don't exaggerate. Don't talk about all the bad things that have happened. Be concise. Be age appropriate in telling them the truth. And don't lie to your kids, because then they won't be able to trust you in the future, and they need to be able to trust what you tell them is true. I really like this recommendations. So instead of saying, for instance, to a child, I'll keep you safe, okay? That's impossible. Like, you can't promise that to a child. And if you promise that to a child and something happens, then what can they believe that you told them, right? Instead, another way to say it might be, I and other adults were working hard to keep you safe. Okay, that's honest, it's true, but you're not making some promise in the universe that you can't keep. Another thing for kids that's super important is just reminding them that you're near, especially little ones. And for very, very little children, yes, they're going to be clingy, and that's exhausting for moms and dads when they're going through crisis. But that nearness to you is reassuring to them. So and for kids who aren't as attached, maybe they're a little bit older, but they still need those reminders that you are nearby. So even when kids are playing, you'll often see children check over to see where their parent is or their significant caregiver, especially kids who have undergone a lot of stress. So they're often checking. So, don't diminish that for the child. Just encourage them. Hey, I'm here. I'm right here. With teenagers, you might even send those texts every, few times during the day. Hey, how are you doing? Everything okay? Or just checking in, especially if a parent's traveling or somehow separated from the family, just checking in together. So spend time with them physically, be near them, move with them. Movement, exercise. Another thing that's really helpful for kids is art, music. Art, music, and movement. These are so valuable for children, so valuable for adults. With children, art and activities like that and playing gives them an ability to express themselves in ways that they might not be able to verbally. The same is really true for adults, though. So there's also value in that movement and exercise. So when kids want to go out and they want to run and play and all these things after something hard or scary has happened, that's okay. Let them do it. It has a very similar purpose for kids as adults. So the physiological response to a traumatic event in an adult means that you've got that cascade of adrenaline and cortisol rushing through your body, right? And anytime your brain is triggered for a threat of danger again, release of adrenaline and cortisol. What does adrenaline do? It makes our heart rate speed up and all that. There are a lot of these other effects in our system. How do we flush out that chemical cascade? Well, we exercise. We drink lots of water. So making sure kids are hydrated. Those are just some real basic things that we can do for kids, but get them moving. And that often means that mom, dad, caregivers, you got to get out and get moving with them. Otherwise, they're just going to sit maybe and watch video games or be on social media. So they need some encouragement to get their bodies moving so that they can, regulating that endocrine system, and it just releases the good hormones and chemicals in the body that makes us feel better. So movement is very, very important. Finally, I would just say, if you're a person of faith, pray with your kids. Pray with them regularly. Let them pray. Maybe even create prayer together. That can be a wonderful bonding time, but it can also be very encouraging to children and helping them feel safe as you remind them of God's love and care for them. Nightly prayers or devotion, that can be worked in as part of your routine that you do. Reciting a favorite Bible verse together. Not only can that be part of your routine, but reciting those verses helps bring all that frontal lobe, all that connection online in the brain. So there's lots of good that can come out of that. Okay, let's talk about special considerations. So teenagers are always special. I love teenagers. Their reactions to trauma, some things you might see. We talked about the school performance might suffer a little bit. They're not concentrating. Well, think about a teenager who's always been a great student, never struggled in school, and suddenly they're struggling to keep up with their classmates, or they're just feeling really depressed and they don't, they're getting behind. They don't want to do the work, and this can be super confusing for them. It can be really demoralizing for kids. But explaining to them the physiology of trauma, just a little bit about trauma being a wound, about how cognitive processing can be diminished, it can be affected by trauma. So it's normal. It's normal to feel overwhelmed. It's normal to lack focus. It's normal to even struggle a little bit in school. So helping kids see this, it can be hard to concentrate. They might be having flashbacks, or they might just be thinking all the time about the people that they're worried about who are also impacted by the event. All of this is normal. You might see that inattention, we said earlier, to personal hygiene or self-care, so that would be worrisome, right, for a teenager. You might see behavior like anger or some depression, which would just be normal. But when you see things like risk-taking or drug or alcohol use, which is kind of avoidant behavior to numb the pain, or you see other risky type behaviors, you definitely want to get help for teenagers with this. And any kind of self-harm, for sure. Any mention of self-harm or harming others is definitely a red flag. And finally, we mentioned survivor's guilt already. If that continues, that survivor's guilt maybe gets more difficult. If it's something they perseverate about, then that requires more professional mental health care. Now, teenagers need their privacy. They also need their peers to discuss things. They need to talk about what's going on, and not just with their parent. They need other teenagers. And so keeping those lines of communication open and encouraging them to reach out to their friends, maybe even ask them the question, so how do you plan to keep in touch with your friends through all of this? And let them know that you approve. You want them to keep in touch with their friends. So they need to express their emotions correctly without us grown-ups putting a spin on it or trying to hide things from them. Eventually, they are going to need to grieve their losses just like adults do. And teenagers can be given meaningful things to do. They can serve, they can help other people, and if they're able to help in meaningful ways, that is a way that they can heal themselves. So give them a job to do, something that's within their capacity to do, and maybe even more importantly, something that affects other people in a positive way. Another consideration would be people with special needs, and we're talking about special medical needs, emotional or cognitive needs. So for medical needs, just making sure that children with special medical needs have the medication that they need and the care that they need and support around them. The other thing for children with special cognitive needs who may be neuroatypical, just asking the questions, how is this situation, how are they perceiving this situation, and how is this situation affecting them, considering noise, considering new surroundings that they might be in, new people that they're encountering, and how that might be affecting this child in a special way. And then finally, just considering how can you create routine and safety for these kids who, again, might be neuroatypical. They might be easily startled by noise. They need a routine, and they need a routine, the much more strict routine than maybe other kids might. So keeping all of those things in mind for them. Now, for those who work with kids, for those who are teachers, you're not a parent of a child, but you are a caregiver or helper in some way, or a teacher. Well, it's important that observation assessment that you do with the kids. And when you ask the question, is this a new behavior? You might not know the child. You might have to reach out and ask the parents or whoever has spent a significant amount of time with them. But just encouraging you to ask the right questions. Don't just assume this is bad behavior going on. And for parents and others who are taking care of kids, and maybe you're sending them to school, let the teachers know. Let the teachers know if the kid has been through some kind of traumatic event or there's a crisis going on in the family. You don't have to share all the details, but giving those teachers and administrators a little awareness and heads up about the situation is so, so appreciated by them, because it's only going to help them to help the child, right? And as much as possible, parents and teachers working together to make the best possible plan and have the best possible outcome for kids in crisis. Now, serious cases. How do you know when you need to seek out professional medical or mental health care for your child? Well, if they're showing serious physical symptoms like extreme weight loss, you definitely want to get care for that right away. Regressive behaviors that are unresolved. So if over time the bedwetting persists or whatever, you want to get some medical care. For all these things are concerning, you always want to have a good checkup. That should be the first recommendation, is go get a good medical checkup first. For kids who are showing serious emotional or behavioral problems, you need to involve professional care. So that could be harming themselves or others. If the problems are getting worse and not improving over time, if there is any loss of touch with reality or a paranoia setting in, those would be immediate red flags to get help, and even to take immediately to a medical facility for care. And any uncontrollable emotional outbursts that, if that increases, or if the severity of those increases, or it happens more often, then you would want to look at professional health care, mental or medical health care. So, any recommendations as we close up? Just keeping in mind, in situations where there's a real risk for children's safety and women, like maybe the moms, if there's moms and children together, a few recommendations from the European Freedom Network against sexual violence and trafficking of women and children. Staying in groups like moms and kids with other moms and kids. Don't let kids go off by themselves to the restroom. This is kind of a all the time thing, but in disaster times, it's very important because there's a lot of chaos, a lot of unknown people. And so just being proactive, connecting and supporting with other women in groups, communicating with trusted people, just being vigilant about children, where they are. And there should be a trusted adult with the child at all times, okay? And really having those good talks with your children about what's safe or unsafe. Okay, so a couple of things to think about as we close. 1, I'd like you to think of 3 things you could do for children you know who are in crisis, or children who've experienced traumatic events. 3 things you could put into place right away. Secondly, I'd like you to think about the parents or the caregivers of those children. How can you support those parents? They're going through a difficult time. It's not easy taking care of kids in crisis. It's not easy being that caregiver. And it may be that the parents themselves are experiencing crisis or trauma. So they need a lot of support. What can you do to put that support in place for them?
Thank you for joining us for this workshop. If you found value in the material covered, please know that the Resilience Resource has more crisis and trauma care tools and resilience building resources for you and your teams as you care for others and yourselves in times of crisis and disaster. You can email us at info@theresilienceresource.org, or you can visit our website at www.theresilienceresource.org.